From ImpactAlpha, it's This Week in Impact, where we bring you some of the most interesting impact investing stories of the week. I'm Brian Walsh, and I'm joined this week by ImpactAlpha editor Jessica Pothering. We'll discuss, with U.S. markets down, up, and sideways, investors at the Milken Global Conference look to ownership, AI, and the rest of the world. Plus, how impact investors are responding to proposed cuts to public health and medical research. And finally, forget your astrological sign. Phenix Capital proposes 4 archetypes for impact fund managers. Are you an impact learner, impact illusionist, silent impact achiever, or impact champion? That's all coming up on This Week in Impact. Hi, Jessica. Welcome back to the podcast. How are you doing this week?
Hi, Brian. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here as always.
All right, well, let's jump right into our first story. What ImpactAlpha overheard at the Milken Global Conference this week? Our Amy Cortese was at the Beverly Hills Hilton in Los Angeles for the annual gathering of 5,000 titans of business and investing, where she reported that Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent urged the audience to look past the current market turbulence and lean into a future of abundance. U.S. markets are anti-fragile, Bessent said. The entirety of our economic history can be distilled in just 5 words: up and to the right. So, Jessica, what were some of the themes that came out of this gathering?
Well, from what my colleague Amy reported on the first day of the event, it was AI, employee ownership, and looking to the rest of the world for leadership.
All right, let's take those one by one. AI is going to eat the world, it seems like. That's what all the reporting and trends seem to suggest. What are these titans of industry saying about AI?
The big thing that came up that Amy reported was concern actually about what this is going to mean for job security. And this, of course, is an issue that kind of comes up with every new technical wave and technical innovation. But, they talk about the knowledge workers worldwide that account for some $40 trillion in salaries and spending and impact. Many of those jobs are at risk.
So if AI is going to disrupt the labor market in significant ways, what are the implications then for existing workers and those that are left behind?
Well, what was interesting is, kind of on the flip side of that conversation, there seemed to be a lot of discussion in the private equity space, at least, around employee ownership, which, my colleague Rudy Sonatas has been covering on our ownership beat quite extensively. But it was interesting to see that theme come up at Milken, with private equity really waking up to this idea that if you give employees a stake in the companies that they work for, then their added investment helps build better and more profitable businesses. And so, it seemed like those two topics were kind of juxtaposed to one another.
So that's somewhat surprising because private equity firms have long been known for laying off workers to boost profits. And so it's kind of a pivot here if they're instead looking for a competitive edge by sharing a portion of their payouts with employees.
That's right. And the latest voice, I think, to chime up about the benefits of employee ownership was Jonathan Sokoloff from the $70 billion private equity firm Leonard Green & Partners. And he spoke at a session at Milken and said in one session, we've been doing this for 30 years and we do it because it's good investing. It makes us more money and it makes our investors more money.
So these are private equity firms. These are not charity cases. And so if they are investing in employee ownership, it's because they see a financial return for that approach.
Yeah, and he cited a big example. Last year, Home Depot acquired a roofing materials business that Leonard Green & Partners had owned since 2017. And Home Depot paid $18 billion in cash for that business called SRS Distribution. And 9,000 of SRS's employees shared in about $3 billion in proceeds. And that was a huge example. But the firm does several of those kinds of deals every year, often on a much smaller basis than that. But Sokoloff mentioned that many of the employee beneficiaries in those deals are working in blue-collar jobs. They're immigrants, they're military veterans, they're formerly incarcerated individuals, and just from other people from other marginalized and often underserved communities.
All right, so that's a compelling example of a private equity firm getting into this. But one of the longtime champions of the employee ownership approach has been Pete Stavros, who is part of private equity giant KKR, which is a $638 billion private equity buyout firm. And Our own Rudy Sonatas and David Bank recently spoke to him about his approach. What are we hearing about how they're doing this?
One of the things that I thought was interesting in his conversation with Rudy and David was that KKR has been at this for a while. They've done 65 or so of these employee ownership deals. And one of the things that is coming up for them now is that companies are sort of proactively seeking them out as a growth partner because they know that KKR has employees' job security and financial well-being in mind, and that this could, play a bigger role in how private equity growth deals transpire in the future. One of the examples he mentioned was this company called Groundworks. It's a contracting company that focuses mostly on property foundations, who in their deal with KKR cited KKR's equity sharing program for its mostly 4,000 blue-collar employees, saying that this will allow every colleague to participate in the success that they help create. And he mentions a few other examples, a $1.6 billion deal with Simon & Schuster, the publishing giant, that also played a role. And so this seems to be coming up more and more.
All right, so the employee ownership is a competitive advantage for these private equity firms to win mandates for some of these buyouts that they do. What else are we hearing?
Well, what's interesting also is that KKR is implementing this strategy not just in the U.S. but also in other parts of the world. So I think it's done deals in Europe, it's done them in Vietnam and Japan and elsewhere, and it's also done some deals with companies that have a lot of unionized workers, which Pete Stavros mentions. Is a lot of people don't think that private equity and unions necessarily go hand in hand. But they have a different take on that, and they have some examples in their portfolio to prove otherwise.
It sounds like Stavros is building a track record here, not just in the U.S. but around the world. But how is that having a broader systemic effect on this concept of employee ownership?
One of the initiatives that he's been working on is to get more private equity firms as well as corporations and labor advocates and foundations engaged in the employee ownership movement through the Ownership Works Association, which I think has some 90 members and is looking to create $20 billion in wealth for workers through ownership strategies by 2030. And Ownership Works has one strategy. There are many pathways for transitioning ownership to employees. Worker-owned co-ops is another one. Employee ownership trusts is another. Stavros is really a champion of all of those models, although he seems to be the biggest champion of employee stock ownership plans, and he's trying to get a bill introduced in Congress later this year that would make it easier for businesses to trade shares to their workers through ESOPs.
Sounds like another play in the playbook for shared prosperity here, increasing access to employee ownership. Well, you can read Amy's Overheard at Milken piece, as well as David and Rudy's KKR Q&A on ImpactAlpha.com. There's also a link in our show notes. For now, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll discuss how health-focused impact investors are navigating the current moment with proposed drastic cuts to public health and medical research funding. Last week, the Trump administration's proposed budget, which will still need to be negotiated and refined by the Republican-controlled Congress, included what the New York Times referred to as, quote, draconian cuts to the National Institutes of Health and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention that experts warned would upend decades of progress in advancing human health, well-being, and longevity. Whew. For example, the plan would slash $18 billion of the NIH budget, shrinking it to $27 billion. Amid this budgetary uncertainty, ImpactAlpha want to know how impact investors focused on health and medical research are responding. Jessica, tell us about what you've been hearing.
So this is just the latest proposal. Actually, impacts of federal spending cuts, in the health sector have been coming up in my reporting in the emerging markets context. Basically from day one of the second Trump administration, when the Trump White House announced its intent to withdraw from the World Health Organization, of which the U.S. was a founding member nearly 80 years ago, and has been one of the largest funders. And then it came up again when the administration gutted USAID, and we were hearing all of these reports of overseas health clinics being shuttered overnight, of life-saving drugs and vaccines getting stuck at in ports and couldn't be distributed to the people who needed them. These new cuts, these new proposed cuts, I guess I should say, if enacted at anything like this kind of scale, would really put at risk the future of health and medical research, not just in the US, but worldwide, because the US government is by far the biggest backer of medical and health research in the world. And so that's just a little bit of the context that was playing in my mind when I reached out to Glenn Rockman at Adjuvant Capital.
All right, so tell me about who Adjuvant Capital is.
Adjuvant Capital, they're a vaccine and drug research venture capital firm that focuses on infectious diseases, mostly in underserved parts of the world. Its biggest backer is the Gates Foundation, but it also has substantial funding from drug companies, family offices, and impact investors. And when I asked Glenn how this could potentially affect their work, or just, what's on his mind right now amid this news, he said, this is really a galvanizing moment for not just venture capital, but also for big pharma, for nonprofits, for family offices, because now we have to figure out how to keep important research at universities and startups moving forward for the public health cause.
And I imagine since the federal government provides so much critical basic funding for basic research, that there's not enough philanthropic and investment capital available to kind of pick up that slack. So these kind of impact investors, family offices, foundations, and fund managers need to be very thoughtful about how do they deploy their capital to get the biggest bang for their buck.
Yeah, and one of the things we talked about was just the role of philanthropic and venture risk capital in this space, and just the need for more innovative finance practices in general in getting, for example, clinical trials for drugs and vaccines across the finish line, and getting those new drugs and vaccines into the market. Glenn said that actually not many venture capital firms in the medical research space have been using tools like procurement contracts or volume guarantees to finance and de-risk portfolio prospects. But these are the kinds of tools that Adjuvant, the Gates Foundation, and others have been using for some time to get life-saving drugs into markets that are often overlooked, and so that these tools could have a broader role to play.
Right. So they have a playbook for how to, with things like advanced market commitments and the like, how to kind of align incentives so that the right types of companies are doing the right types of investments and have the incentive to do those investments that will unlock these life-saving discoveries and treatment programs in the markets that can tend to be overlooked otherwise.
That's right.
Well, can you give me an example of one of these types of programs in practice?
Yes. One thing Adjuvant uses as a funding stream is the sale of these vouchers from the Food and Drug Administration called priority review vouchers, which are a pricey but tradable asset that can basically fast track drug and vaccine treatment review. And that's a tool that Adjuvant picked up from the nonprofit Global Health Investment Fund, which is a sister fund of sorts to the for-profit Adjuvant. And the Global Health Investment Fund had used it successfully in a treatment for river blindness, which mostly affects communities in Africa. And so that voucher was sold for $40 million, and that more than covered the $13 million costs for the drug's final development for the river blindness treatment. So that was a successful example of how they were able to fund that treatment and then also recycle some money back into the Global Health Investment Fund for new treatments and drugs.
Fascinating. All right. So what else did you hear from your conversation?
So Glenn, really, he mentioned that they're lucky they work with an LP base that is very focused on long-term public health missions and really keeps, impact top of mind. And he said, there's this one broader lesson from not just their strategy, but their base of LPs is that these are investors that have seen ups and downs in the global health markets before. Plugging gaps is something that they're comfortable with. And he's pretty confident, at least in the short term, that if companies are close to solving an unmet medical need, there's going to be a market for those products. And his long-term thinking is that the US will continue to be an innovator in medical and drug research, and that, industry, private capital, philanthropy, all of those combined will find a way to keep that innovation moving forward.
All right. Well, you can read Jessica's full story on the challenges impact investors in the health sector are navigating on impactalpha.com. There's also a link in our show notes. For now, let's take one more quick break. When we come back, we'll discuss Phenix Capital's 4 archetypes for impact fund managers. Astrology may be having a cultural moment, but at Impact Alpha, we're less interested in your zodiac sign and more interested in what type of impact investor you are. In a guest post for us, Phenix Capital proposed a simple yet compelling 2x2 chart on the 4 faces of impact. All right, Jessica, so imagine this 2x2 chart. On your X or horizontal axis, you have impact storytelling, and that's from weak to strong. And then on the Y or vertical axis, you have impact potential and foundation. So the practices and reporting. And that goes from low and weak to high and strong. Okay, so classic 2x2 here. And in any classic 2x2, you want to be in the top right quadrant. That's the place to be.
Just like Scott Benson's assessment of the U.S. economy, up and to the right.
That's the U.S. economy, or at least the historical precedent for it, according to our Treasury Secretary. All right, so Jessica, walk us through these 4 faces of impact. Let's start top and to the right, the ones that are high and strong on impact potential and foundation, and high and strong on impact storytelling.
Brian, I'm really glad that you're geeking out about this 2x2 chart as much as I am, because I also really enjoyed this when I was looking at it and reading it this week. Yes, okay, so to the top right corner is the impact champion. And this is kind of the ideal archetype that Phenix Capital has identified. These are fund managers with high impact potential, super robust reporting and impact practices, very transparent and comprehensive reporting, and just they tell a good impact story. And Phenix advises, for any investors that are looking for impact fund managers to include in their portfolio, that these are the ones to include because these will help maximize your contribution to positive social and environmental impact.
So these are the folks that are doing the work, but also telling the story of how they're doing the work well.
Exactly.
All right. What do we have next?
So then in the upper left, we have the silent impact achiever. The kind of key characteristics of these fund managers are they have very high impact potential, very robust reporting practices, but are not necessarily great at telling their impact story. So we don't hear from them as often as maybe we would like. And for investors that are supporting these types of fund managers, Phenix, encourages their LPs to help them tell their story better, to highlight their impact more.
And that kind of silent impact achiever might also be a strategy. We've been hearing in recent weeks about the concept of green hushing or impact hushing, something I've also likened to incognito impact mode. Incognito browsing on your on your web browser. There's folks that are doing that incognito impact where they're doing the good work, but for a variety of reasons, maybe the political context or maybe because of the LP base that they have, they're a little bit quiet on how they tell the story of their impact.
That's true. I mean, that's interesting that you bring that up because, that could now be a more proactive strategy to be a silent impact achiever. From my experience as a reporter, though, this comes up for me a lot, actually, because my job is to reach out to fund managers, especially learn about their strategies, what they're doing, what they're excited about. And I find so many of them that are doing really interesting work and just really don't have the tools or resources or time sometimes to talk about the work that they're doing in a compelling way. And so I feel like this field is full of silent impact achievers whose stories would just be much better put out into the open.
All right. Do you hear that, silent impact achievers? Don't hide your light under a bushel. Let it shine for the whole world to see. Which brings us, I guess, to our third archetype here. Tell us about that one.
Yes, so in the bottom right corner is the impact illusionist. These are fund managers that have great storytelling skills, but not necessarily great impact foundations. And these are the ones where there could potentially be a risk of impact washing if those foundations really aren't as robust as the story makes it seem. And so the advice from Phenix Capital to LPs or investors that are diligencing impact fund managers is to really engage with these managers more, to mitigate the risk of impact washing, and support them by bolstering their impact foundations and just being very careful in their investment selection process.
So these are the showboats, those with all the razzmatazz and the sparkles and the sequins.
There it is.
But there's maybe not as much robust actual data collection and as much rigor to how they're thinking about and managing and measuring their impact. All right. Finally, our fourth category here, the fourth archetype. What do we have?
Yes, that's the impact learner. These are often early stage fund managers that may have lower impact potential and may have high impact potential, frankly. They're in the process of developing their impact foundations. They also haven't really fully developed their impact narrative. And the goal here is to help these managers not only adopt best impact practices, support their impact foundations, but also, help them craft their own story and impact narrative. And just on a personal note, I come across impact learners all the time. A lot of the early stage or emerging fund managers that I report on, most of the business is just in getting the fund up and running, getting people on your investment committee, and getting all of those basic investment practices and the thesis honed. And storytelling is not always, sort of foremost in their mind or the place that they would necessarily direct scarce resources. And so I feel like there's a real opportunity here to help early stage fund managers, yes, with the impact foundations, but also, as it applies to the work that I do in crafting that narrative and telling that story.
All right, dear listeners, so let's leave it with you. Which archetype are you? Are you an impact champion, a silent impact achiever, an impact illusionist, or an impact learner? You can tell us in our Slack channel. If you go to the article that's linked in our show notes, you can join the Slack community and offer your take on what of these archetypes you have. You can also post about this and tag us on LinkedIn or your social media platform of choice. But for now, that's going to do it for this episode of This Week in Impact. Thank you, Jessica.
Thanks a lot, Brian.
And thank you all for listening. This Week in Impact is a production of ImpactAlpha and part of the ImpactAlpha podcast network. Smart conversations by and for impact investing professionals. For exclusive stories and insights about the world of impact investing and sustainable finance, join thousands of other agents of impact by subscribing. Just go to impactalpha.com/subscribe for full access. Thanks, as always, to our producer extraordinaire, Isaac Silk. For Jessica Pothering, I'm Brian Walsh, Managing Director of the strategic advisory firm Human Nature. We'll see you next week for more Impact.